I'm reading from Sons of Mississippi, The Story of Race and Its Legacy by Paul Hendrickson. Chapter Grimsley. Law enforcement was in the hands of bigots and bigotry was respectable. C. Van Woodward, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. His neck seems violently red against the tight white collar. James Agee. Let us now praise famous men. He loved his lid. Boys, I'm getting me a Stetson hat, and y'all are going to wear one too, he told his dozen deputies on the first or second day he came into office. He got it steamed and blocked and dented just so. The leather band on the inside must be a greasy and sweat-filled smelling black. Congealed sweat and vitalis gone so rancid it's turned the corner and become strangely fine. Did he go all the way to New Orleans to a famous hatter on St. Charles Avenue just to buy his beaver chapeau? Somebody knew him pretty well back then and remembered that. In any case, there must have been some large vanity in this hefty man. Even though others have wondered in retrospect whether the gaudy strut and effusive greeting, "Hello, son," he'd cry at you from across Pascagoula Street, if you were white, were just a reaction to how ugly he felt inside. So maybe the colorfulness people speak of was cloaking a fearsome lack of self-worth. His face was deeply pocked. His bulbous nose was deeply veined. The head law enforcer went around his county with breath generally stinking from liquor. His name was James Ira Grimsley. He's second to the left. He's 50. Let him go on guffawing a little bit more in this silvered September light. His hands stuck in his trouser pockets, his specs sliding downward. He'll be on Earth for another 25 years until his diseased liver and his bestosis carry him off. He may have gotten the first germs of it inside him decades ago when he worked in the local shipyards. He's going to die alone on a Monday, October 19th, 1987, in a boxy little pine board house at 2506 Grimsley Drive in the sweltering town at the bottom of the state on the Gulf Coast where he was born and reared and is a head lawman now. His wife will have gone before him. There won't be any children. Apparently, there'll be no money. Poise him in your imagination undisturbed, even as he's held on the sheet of developing paper. All photographs are abandoning, a cultural critic at the Washington Post, Henry Allen, once wrote. Once there was a moment, the click of the shutter, now it's gone. A framed ghost, abandoned by time and failing memory. This is the sediment at the heart of photography's mechanical mystery. This framed, inebriated ghost isn't going to be abandoned. You'll hear about his life and the way of his hypocritical and equally bigoted fellow Pascagoulians began to forsake him after they'd allow him to become their drunken hero within several months of when this photograph was made. They forsook him not because they were morally ashamed of either his or their own behavior, but because their livelihoods and financial well-being seemed suddenly in the balance. They'd grown terrified that the federal government, disgusted with Mississippi, and in particular with some of their own actions, might cancel lucrative contracts at the big Pascagoula shipyard. on which their economy so depended. But first, a few pages in a broader vein about high sheriffs and Mississippi in the torn years of civil rights. The word sheriff is said to derive from the 13th century England, when kings began the practice of appointing officers of the court known as the shire reeves or reeves of the shire. They were personal representatives of the king, empowered to collect his revenue and to preserve his peace. The office of sheriff, thought to be the oldest law enforcement office within the common law system, may go back, if not by name, then in function, as far as the 9th century. So in Great Britain, a sheriff was an important figure even before the Magna Carta. Sometimes he entered the realm of legend. The Sheriff of Nottingham, for instance, who pursued Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest in the 12th century. In Mississippi, not any longer, but for a longer while than most states of the Union, really right into the modern times, sheriff always stood for two things: the district's tax collector and its top cop, who possessed nearly unassailable authority. And that's how a candidate campaigned for the countrywide job. If he got elected, he could expect to get his cut of every tax dime taken in. But the ways in which he became rich, not that all Mississippi sheriffs actually did, didn't necessarily have to do with these fractions, which were normally about 5%. A corrupt sheriff in Mississippi in the 50s and 60s made most of his illicit loot from payoffs for allowing whiskey joints to remain open. He made it from skims on prostitution and gambling he'd permit to go on within his borders. Depending on the level of his corruption and avarice, depending on the makeup of the county itself, he could get quite wealthy, or only happily fixed. There's an old saying in Mississippi, all you have to do is get that thing once. The thing being the office of sheriff. That's not a truism anymore, or so almost everybody insists, including the current holders of the office. Nowadays, there are checks and balances on the office. Some. There were dry counties and wet counties back then, but liquor was illegal in every county and had been since 1908, except that the state legislature had passed something called the black market tax, meaning that there was legal taxation on a product that didn't lawfully exist. In certain towns and counties, the prohibition law was completely ignored, and joints and package stores operated openly, if not with impunity, at least with no fear of being shut down, so long as they kept to their payoff schedules. The sheriff had to get his monthly bribe, but others did too. The sheriff, after all, was keeping the place clean, no sales to minors. If the bar owners and package store proprietors operated within a town's limits, they could expect to get arrested by the constabulary once a month, say on a Monday morning, and then they'd be more or less happily trooped down to City Hall to pay their $100 fine, allowing them to stay open for the next 30 days. The money theoretically went into the city kitty. In terms of what were called lawful earnings, the head lawman worked on a complicated fee and commission system. He got a percentage from selling license tags, for serving a summons or a subpoena, from taking bail bonds, for feeding prisoners, for making arrests. He paid his deputies out of these fees and commissions. His deputies, picked by him, were on a salary set by him. The deputies, like constables, these were low-level law enforcement officials managing a beat within the county, made mileage money whenever a prisoner was brought to a justice of the peace. The constable, unlike the deputy, also got paid a percentage of every fine, along with the JP and others. So on the level of law enforcement, there was a financial incentive to write tickets and to make arrests on trumped-up charges. Civil rights workers were the fattest targets in the 60s. It doesn't need explaining. You can go through old newspapers and find in fine print under court proceedings entries like this one. Milton Hancock fined $175 by Judge Orman Kimbrough, $50 for reckless driving, $25 for improper equipment on automobile, $10 for resisting arrest. Car had no muffler, no right headlight, and did not look in good operating order. Theoretically, a sheriff could be removed from office, but it was mostly a theory. There was some sort of archaic provision on the books that the county coroner could resist the sheriff in emergency. The sheriff's police power, extending to the next county line, was absolute, which isn't to say that weak men didn't sometimes get into office and become victims of their own power. Or maybe victims of the racist mayor, who perhaps kept his white sheet folded in the top drawer of the dresser in his bedroom. Or maybe victims of the leaders of the local Ku Klux Klan, who in some cases had their offices downtown with Klan insignia on the door. Or maybe victims of the heads of that county's chapter of the White Citizens Council, who in a way were the most pernicious Mississippians of all, since they attempted to conduct their bigotry with a kind of Rotarian respectability. Sheriffs in Mississippi during the years of civil rights were of a type, but they also ran the gamut of human nature. If virtually none could be said to be anywhere near benevolent in his treatment of blacks, it seems equally true that only the vilest hatred with a pure, white, unrelenting hatred. More than a few had to have been sadists. There's actually plenty of testimony around to make you believe that. It was as if a legacy of slavery came with their office, and so they lived up to it. That's kind of an epitaph for white Mississippi itself, and yet nothing is monolithic. As a noted book critic, Benjamin Schwartz has written of Southern law officers in general in a 1998 review of the important work of scholarship titled Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow by Leon F. Witwack. Because of current standards, nearly all white Southerners were racist. It's easy to assume that there is no point of distinguishing between their racist attitudes. But it is doubtful whether a black sharecropper visiting a strange town in rural Arkansas, for instance, wouldn't care whether its sheriff was a segregationist who opposed violence and favored a degree of protection to blacks, however inadequate to modern eyes, or whether he was a virulent racist who would deny blacks the most basic rights and indeed encourage threats to their lives and property. Although perhaps both figures are reprehensible, both sorts of white men lived throughout the South, and the difference between them could, for a black man, mean life or death.